Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.2, The Red Sultan. Trying to nail down who exactly the Young Turks were is a bit of a historical conundrum. Were the Young Turks a conspiracy of Western-facing Freemasons modeling themselves off of Giuseppe Mazzini's Young Italy? Or were they anti-Western modernizers in the style of Meiji Japan, hoping to bring European-style modernization into their lands, specifically in order to halt the onslaught of European imperialism? Or perhaps the Young Turks were the spiritual descendants of the Young Ottomans, who, inspired by French revolutionary ideas, sought to build an inclusive empire of Ottoman citizens equal before the law regardless of ethnic or religious heritage. Or maybe they were chauvinistic Turkish nationalists, wanting to forge an exclusive national identity, promoting Turkish interests above all other national interests and accentuating the empire's unique Islamic character. Or were the Young Turks a bunch of cynical opportunists, co-opting opposition elements within the empire in order to simply bring themselves to power? Or were they just a bunch of naive, hot-headed, and overly idealistic young kids whose ignorance would run the empire into the ground? Well, folks, throughout their relatively short history, the group historically dubbed the Young Turks would amazingly encompass nearly all of these contradictory ideologies and conflicting agendas. Now, that is not to say that the small dictatorial group who would eventually solidify their power in 1913 after the raid on the Sublime Porte, which occurred 5 years after the original constitutional revolution, pursued all of these ideologies and agendas. Quite to the contrary, the so-called three pashas, Ahmed Jamal, Ismail Enver, and Mehmed Talat, who would, after this 1913 coup, emerge as the revolution's most famous and most powerful leaders, would in fact pursue a much, much narrower vision of what the revolution had been all about. And so, our task in tracing the story of the Young Turks will be to understand just how the 1908 Constitutional Revolution, which preached liberal cosmopolitan egalitarianism, and which had a base of support as diverse as the Ottoman Empire itself, with Turks, Albanians, Kurds, Bulgarians, Jews, Greeks, Arabs, and Armenians, would morph over the next 10 years to become a highly centralized three-man dictatorial committee promoting a very, very specific vision of militant Turkish chauvinism. Because, much like the parallel revolution that would go down simultaneously over in Russia, the Young Turk Revolution also began as a broad effort to depose an autocratic, repressive regime and to replace that regime with a free society centered around a liberal, modern constitutional monarchy. And also like this parallel revolution in Russia, the changes brought about by the Young Turk Revolution would similarly affect the lives of millions of people across a vast geographic space running from Libya to Baghdad to Sarajevo and beyond. So, if the story of the Russian Revolution is in some ways the story of how Central and Eastern Europe were hurled into the modern age, then the story of the Young Turk Revolution is the story of the creation of the modern Middle East, the modern Balkans, and of course, modern Turkey. And not to kill a dead horse here, but just as the story of the Russian Revolution cannot simply be boiled down to the Bolsheviks, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, versus the Tsar, the Young Turk Revolution is not as simple as the three pashas, Jamal, Enver, and Talat, versus the Sultan. There were many, many different individuals and organizations and factions and parties involved in the Young Turk Revolution. And in order to properly tell this story, we will have to consider all of these competing visions of what the revolution meant, or better yet, what it could have meant, or should have meant. But like many revolutions, if there was one thing holding the Young Turk coalition together leading up to 1908, it was a generalized opposition to the reigning sovereign, Sultan Abdul Hamid. So today we will begin our story of the Young Turks by examining the legacy of their common enemy, whom they would come to call the Red Sultan. Just like the Young Turks, who would go on to overthrow him, Sultan Abdul Hamid can be a bit hard to nail down. Because while Abdul Hamid was in many ways an autocratic tyrant known for his wild paranoia, which he would express through highly repressive domestic policies, as well as through what were at times murderous campaigns against the minority populations of his empire, in other ways, Abdul Hamid was an enlightened despot. As we'll see, Abdul Hamid would successfully lead his empire out of the crisis of the 19th century and embark on some pretty audacious reform projects that would, for example, see a rationalization of the judicial system and an expansion of infrastructure, with new telegraph lines improving communication and new rail lines, which included the famed Orient Express running from Paris to Vienna to Constantinople. And then Abdul Hamid would also put a new emphasis on education as he built new schools across the empire, including a network of professional schools that began to churn out lawyers, doctors, military officers, and bureaucrats, many of whom would be destined to fill the Sultan's administration. And so the Sultan hoped that this emerging class of professionals would form a cohort of technocrats loyal to his throne. But as is probably obvious, the loyalty of this new professional class would have its limits. Because while the Sultan would build up a vast patronage network of loyal officials, many of the revolutionaries who would make up the vanguard of the Young Turks would come out of these professional schools, especially the medical schools and, more importantly, the military schools. And where the Sultan would lose control of this process, so to speak, was in his effort to indoctrinate this generation of newly educated Ottomans. Because, as part of Abdul Hamid's educational reforms, he would essentially try to build a personality cult around himself as the Sultan Caliph, putting new emphasis on his role as the world leader of Islam and reinventing Ottoman imperial mythology. So, Abdul Hamid would go to great pains to publicly demonstrate his role as the Islamic Caliph through elaborate religious ceremonies and through bestowing imperial ranks and privileges, and often extravagant gifts like giant mansions, upon officials who proved themselves to be especially loyal. And in these ways, Abdul Hamid would turn away from the Tanzimat style of governing in which the sultans had intentionally downplayed their role as caliph as they tried to secularize the empire. And then the Tanzimat had also been the real heyday for the Ottoman imperial bureaucracy. And this powerful bureaucracy is what you will often hear referred to as the Sublime Porte. Well, during the Tanzimat, the bureaucrats of the Sublime Porte were in some ways even more powerful than the sultans, as grand viziers and other officials would drive Ottoman policy. But with the ascension of Abdul Hamid, the Sultan began to check the power of these bureaucrats, as personal loyalty to Abdul Hamid, the Sultan Caliph, became ever more important for the job security of these officials. So, Abdul Hamid would prove himself to be a pretty masterful politician, as he skillfully built this loyal base of supporters in a method not all that different from what Muhammad Ali had done down in Egypt a half-century earlier. But while Abdul Hamid was successful in building a new imperial structure in which loyalty to him personally was most important, a new opposition would still slowly emerge within this class of newly educated professional elites, much to the Sultan's continual frustration. And initially, it would be this opposition within the new professional class who would come to be dubbed the Young Turks. And as their size and influence grows, they will gradually coalesce around the idea of demanding a reinstatement of the lost Ottoman constitution of 1876. So let's revisit that lost constitution, because it will be the great talisman for the Young Turks as they lead their opposition against Sultan Abdul Hamid. As we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the revolutionary coalition who will challenge the Sultan in 1908 will not simply be made up of young Turkish intellectuals, even though their name would of course suggest this. Instead, the 1908 Revolutionary Coalition would encompass a wide array of ideological beliefs and a surprisingly diverse mix of ethnic groups, with Slavic revolutionaries from Macedonia and Armenian revolutionaries from eastern Anatolia playing an especially important role. And in order to bundle together this dizzying cornucopia of Turks, Bulgarians, Armenians, Macedonians, Kurds, Albanians, Greeks, etc., the revolution will need one of those great abstract ideals just vague enough to momentarily hold everyone together. And that vague abstract ideal will crystallize in the form of the lost 1876 Constitution. So let's head back to the very start of Abdul Hamid's reign in the fall of 1876. You may remember from our final episodes in Season 1, 1.16, The Great Eastern Crisis, and 1.17, Balkan Liberation, that Abdul Hamid had originally been brought to power through a series of coups launched by Midhat Pasha and his young Ottoman followers. And these coups went down amidst the chaos of the Great Eastern Crisis, as the empire was declaring bankruptcy and facing complete diplomatic isolation as a result of the nationalist uprisings in the Balkans, and the mishandling of these uprisings by Ottoman leaders, a mishandling which had led to the massacring of tens of thousands of Bulgarian civilians. Well, amidst this chaos, Midhat Pasha had at first deposed Sultan Abdul Aziz, who was Abdul Hamid's uncle, by the way, in favor of Sultan Murad, who was Abdul Hamid's brother. Then the newly anointed Murad had a nervous breakdown and proved himself completely unfit to handle his new role. And so Midhat Pasha and the young Ottomans would launch yet another coup against Murad after he had been on the throne for all of 1 month. And this series of coups would then lead to the anointing of Abdul Hamid as Sultan on August 31st, 1876. And one of the very first acts that Abdul Hamid took as Sultan was to promulgate Midhat Pasha's constitution in December of that very same year. And this will be the irony of Abdul Hamid's rule, in that his time as Sultan will be bookended by the promulgation and then re-promulgation of the Midhat Constitution. First in 1876, when his rule first began, and then again in 1908, when the Young Turks would force him to reintroduce it. And this reintroduction of the Constitution would begin a process that would end with the Sultan's eventual demise. So the question then becomes, why and how did Abdul Hamid get rid of the Midhat Constitution in the first place? Well, to answer that question, let us hop aboard Carl Sagan's ship of the imagination and head on to Constantinople to enjoy a nice spring day in the great imperial capital. It is March 19th, 1877. And the General Assembly of the First Ottoman Parliament is getting ready to gather at the Dolmabahce Palace to be sworn in by the 34-year-old Sultan Abdul Hamid. The new members of this parliament had all congregated in the main assembly hall of the palace, sitting beneath its gaudy ceilings encrusted in gold and alabaster, and under which hung the world's largest crystal chandelier, a fitting tribute to the reckless spending that had brought the empire to its current state of crisis. But even with this ongoing crisis, amongst this General Assembly, there was still a widespread feeling of cautious optimism and some fairly broad support for the newly anointed Sultan, who had begun his rule just 6 months earlier, and who most people at the time viewed as a progressive reformer associated with the young Ottomans who had brought him to power. So, Sultan Abdul Hamid and the members of the General Assembly carried with them the hopes of an entire empire on the brink of collapse. And when the First Ottoman Parliament convened, it was amidst a sort of surreal feeling of apocalyptic optimism, with many Ottoman subjects, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, placing their hopes and dreams in their new Sultan and his newly elected General Assembly, praying to their respective gods that the delegates could steer the Ottoman Empire into a new age of prosperity and equality. And the First General Assembly was perhaps most defined by its diversity, as its members truly represented the Ottoman melting pot, with Turks, Greeks, Arabs, Armenians, Jews, Kurds, all showing up to represent the interests of their people. And at first, the Ottoman Parliament and its 1876 constitution were both widely hailed as signaling the dawning of a new constitutional age in the Ottoman Empire, the culmination of the Tanzimat that had brought Western reform to Constantinople. But just a month after the inauguration of this parliamentary government, Russia would declare war on the Ottoman Empire. And then by June 1877, the Russian Imperial Army had crossed the Danube into Ottoman Bulgaria. And even though it would be a hard-fought war, as we saw at the end of Season 1, the Russians would make it all the way to the gates of Constantinople within just 6 months, leaving the Ottomans to face the prospect of near total defeat at the hands of their longtime imperial nemesis. So, amidst this state of emergency, with the Russian Imperial Army ready to take the imperial capital any day now, Sultan Abdul Hamid summoned members of the Ottoman parliament to weigh in on the crisis. But during the course of the war, the Sultan had stalled in summoning his parliament and was at this point months late in making this call. So these members of parliament did not respond well to Abdul Hamid, and they mostly just made it clear that they had had no part in getting the empire into this mess, and they would not be scapegoated last minute by Abdul Hamid. And while being scapegoated last minute by the Sultan for the Russian defeat was an understandable concern, the immediate result of this hostile posture on the part of the parliament was that Abdul Hamid decided that he really had no use for parliaments, and so the very next day, on February 14th, 1878, Abdul Hamid suspended the Constitution of 1876, dissolved the First Ottoman Parliament, and placed the most prominent members of Parliament under house arrest. And so, just like that, less than a year after the General Assembly had been sworn in, the first constitutional era of the Ottoman Empire was brought to an abrupt and sudden close. When Abdul Hamid dissolved the First Ottoman Parliament, it was not clear whether this was done merely as a temporary emergency measure, and whether the assembly would be reinstituted once the current crisis had passed. However, it quickly became apparent that Abdul Hamid had zero intention of reconvening Parliament or of having his power limited in any way by a silly piece of paper, just because a bunch of reformers called that piece of paper a constitution. And in hindsight, his decision to dissolve the parliament and suspend the constitution was really the turning point in Abdul Hamid's reign, because he had clearly begun to believe that representative government was only a hindrance, and that if the Ottoman Empire was going to emerge out of its current crisis somewhat intact, the Sultan would have to take personal control of the situation. And so, Abdul Hamid would do his best to personally steer his empire through the storm that was the Great Eastern Crisis and the resultant war with Russia. And as we just discussed, given the circumstances, i.e. the empire being on the verge of collapse, the new Sultan honestly did a decent job. I mean, sure, yeah, the Congress of Berlin, which established the post-war settlement, was incredibly humiliating for the Ottomans, and they lost about 2/5 of their territory. But through diplomatic maneuvering at the Congress, the Ottomans managed to retain a pretty sizable chunk of territory in the southern Balkans, meaning that they had not been driven completely out of Europe, which the Russians had made very clear that they very much wanted to do with the initial treaty terms at San Stefano. And the careful diplomacy of the Ottomans at the Congress of Berlin would set a precedent for Abdul Hamid's reign, as the Sultan would, over the next 30 years, continue the long-established Ottoman practice, first mastered by Tanzimat leaders, of appeasing the great powers while also playing them off of one another, all in order to ensure the long-term security of the empire. And as we will see next week, this diplomatic strategy of great power appeasement will at times mean letting go of certain territories on the periphery of the empire in order to ensure the safety of the empire's core. More specifically, it will mean allowing Britain and France to encroach on their territory in North Africa in order to ensure their continued control over Anatolia, the Middle East, and the Southern Balkans. And then even before they would let go of North Africa, the Ottomans would, at the Congress of Berlin, allow the British to occupy and administer the Ottoman island of Cyprus in an effort to ensure British support for the Ottomans retaining control of Macedonia and Thrace, the strategic regions of the southern Balkans. And then the Ottomans were also able to finagle a somewhat decent agreement at the Congress surrounding the empire's finances. Because while the Ottomans were still up to their eyeballs in debt, as we mentioned last week, their financial situation ironically improved somewhat when the Europeans established the Ottoman Public Debt Commission in the wake of the Congress of Berlin. Because even though this European meddling in the Ottoman treasury was also pretty humiliating, the commission rationalized the public debt to make it actually serviceable for the Ottomans. And the new Christian nation-states established at the Congress were each made to take on their share of the debt, as this was basically the great powers' way of making sure that they got paid back by splitting up the debt amongst several different governments. And this rationalization of the public debt is what gave Abdul Hamid the financial breathing room he needed to embark on all the reform projects we just talked about in education, transportation, communications, and so on. So, as we can see, in the wake of the 1878 Congress of Berlin, Abdul Hamid would do a pretty good job leading his hobbling empire out of the storm that was the Great Eastern Crisis. But the thing is, Abdul Hamid's experience dealing with this acute crisis early in his rule convinced the Sultan that it was essential for him to personally steer the empire out of its abysmal state. So, after the Sultan emerged from the war with Russia, he did not reconvene parliament or reinstate the constitution. And instead, over the next 30 years, Abdul Hamid would consolidate his rule as an autocratic monarch, centralizing his imperial authority at the expense of regional governors, and gradually taking away power even from his own ministers and bureaucrats. And as we will see, Abdul Hamid's autocratic tendencies did not only manifest in the consolidation of his personal rule within the imperial government, but would also gradually extend into the lives of everyday people throughout the Ottoman Empire. Because if the war with Russia had convinced Abdul Hamid of the need for strong, personalized rule, then the series of assassinations and coups that had initially brought him to power, but had been staged against his uncle and then his brother, convinced Abdul Hamid that there were enemies everywhere, always trying to undermine him, always trying to kill him. And throughout Abdul Hamid's 30-year reign, his paranoid fear of assassination would only increase because the late 19th century and early 20th century was the true pinnacle of anarchist assassinations of public officials. Put simply, it was a uniquely hazardous time to be a head of state. But Abdul Hamid had zero intention of dying. So, the Sultan carried a pistol with him everywhere he went. He forbade the army from training with live ammunition. He fed all of his food to his dog first to check for poison. And he even left the extravagant luxuries of Dolmabahce Palace because the palace sat right alongside the Bosphorus, and he was afraid of a naval bombardment. So, the Sultan would move further inland to Yildiz Palace, a large imperialist state that Abdul Hamid would basically turn into like a zombie apocalypse-style bunker that was enclosed by unscalable walls guarded by literally 7,000 imperial troops. And inside these walls was a fully sustainable survivalist compound with a farm, stables, and artisan workshops. Yeah, like I said, Abdul Hamid had no intention of dying. And this paranoid fear of assassination would ripple out to all corners of the empire because, basically in order to ensure his own personal safety, Abdul Hamid established an extensive secret police called the Yildiz Intelligence Agency. At its height, this secret police employed tens of thousands of agents who would spy on people, arbitrarily arrest anyone who seemed vaguely suspicious, censor the press of dissenting opinion, infiltrate secret revolutionary societies, of which there were many, and the agency even operated internationally, keeping an eye on exiled revolutionaries living abroad and spying on foreign governments. And Abdul Hamid would spend hours and hours at his Yildiz complex, feeding his paranoia by reading thousands of these reports each month. And most importantly for our story, in the last decade of Abdul Hamid's rule, the Sultan's number one target would become the Committee of Union and Progress, and the growing popularity of these annoying, bratty kids that everyone was calling the Young Turks. So, with Abdul Hamid establishing an autocratic monarchy with an ever-present secret police, I think we can safely say that the first Ottoman experiment in liberal representative government failed miserably. And even though there was initially widespread optimism in response to the 1876 Constitution, the effort to create a constitutional monarchy in the Ottoman Empire was honestly pretty half-baked. And now that the constitution had been suspended, it was painfully obvious to everyone that the Sultan had only promulgated the constitution in the first place because he had literally been placed on the throne by Midhat Pasha and his young Ottoman followers, who demanded a constitution as a pretext for him being appointed as Sultan. And then even the Constitution itself was the result of a compromise and was really only halfway done because it critically left the Sultan as the sovereign authority, with power emanating down from the Sultan instead of up from the Ottoman people. And most importantly, in practical terms, Abdul Hamid retained the right to exile anyone deemed a threat to the Ottoman state. And the new Sultan had exercised this right shockingly fast when he exiled Midhat Pasha himself, father of the 1876 Constitution, in February of 1877, less than 2 months after Midhat's constitution had been promulgated. Midhat Pasha had been the driving force behind the 1876 Constitution, as the most prominent leader of the young Ottomans, and really the last great politician of the Tanzimat era. And Midhat had also been one of the primary conspirators who had deposed Sultan Abdul Aziz and shortly thereafter Sultan Murad. And as we saw, these coups had brought Abdul Hamid to power in the first place. So, less than 6 months after literally giving Abdul Hamid his throne, Midhat Pasha was exiled to Europe by the new Sultan he had just put into power. Now, at first, things weren't so bad for Midhat, as he was basically the most popular Ottoman politician in all of Europe. So he just bopped around for a few months, making his case for Western-style reform in the Ottoman Empire to European audiences who were always eager to hear about the benefits of Westernization in Ottoman lands. But his fortunes would change within a few years when Abdul Hamid blamed Midhat for the death of his uncle, the former Sultan Abdul Aziz. And yes, I know, their names sound exactly the same, but Abdul Aziz was Abdul Hamid's uncle. Now, most accept that Abdul Aziz died by suicide, so these were trumped-up charges stemming mostly from Abdul Hamid's conspiratorial paranoia. And because of this, Midhat's execution was delayed, leaving him in limbo as he was locked up in an Arabian prison with his fate left uncertain. But in the meantime, Abdul Hamid took it upon himself to send in one of his agents to assassinate the former Grand Vizier and to make his death appear like an accident. And so Midhat Pasha, the last great reformer of the Tanzimat, was assassinated in his prison cell on April 26, 1883. The exile and assassination of Midhat Pasha, the Constitution's biggest cheerleader, was one of the clearest signals that Abdul Hamid would not be manipulated by the young Ottomans or have his power curtailed by a parliament. And looking back at the period between 1876 and 1878, when Midhat's constitution was in effect, we can see that even though historians call this period the first constitutional era, it really wasn't an era at all, as much as a tiny blip. And while these 2 years were hugely transformative for the empire, in the big picture, the transformation that the empire did go through honestly had very little to do with constitutionalism, and much more to do with the acute crisis brought about by having the Russian army at the gates of Constantinople. Because when Abdul Hamid dismissed parliament, news that the constitutional experiment in Ottoman lands was now at an end was largely overshadowed by the much more shocking news just a few days later of the incredibly harsh terms imposed by the Russians at the Treaty of San Stefano, which essentially proposed an end to the 600-year Ottoman presence in Europe. As we discussed, though, these incredibly harsh terms would be revised just a few months later at the Congress of Berlin, when the great powers, under the influence of Bismarck's Realpolitik, drew up a bunch of borders in the Balkans and laid out a bunch of terms for the people of the Balkans, without consulting anyone who actually lived in the Balkans. And so, these new borders and treaty terms made everyone involved equally angry and resentful, each for their own reasons. But while all parties involved, with the exception of maybe the British and the Austrians, deeply resented the ultimate settlement at the Congress of Berlin, by far the biggest losers coming out of the Congress were the Ottomans. After all the wheeling and dealing was over and done with, and the dust had finally settled, the Ottomans had lost no less than 2/5 of their empire, meaning that the cascading sequence of events that had been initiated by the Balkan uprisings in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Bulgaria, and that had ended with the unequivocal defeat at the hands of the Russians, had ultimately led to an outright dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. Because while I have gone to great pains to demonstrate the ways that Ottoman leaders used careful diplomacy to lessen the impact of the Treaty of Berlin, in the end, all of this was really just damage control. Simply put, the war with Russia had been a catastrophic defeat, and the territorial settlement at the Congress of Berlin would fundamentally change the Ottoman Empire. And in a very broad sense, this fundamental change can be boiled down to the fact that the Ottomans had lost control of nearly all of their Christian lands in Europe, which they had ruled for about half a millennia. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro were now all fully independent. And then Bulgaria and Bosnia-Herzegovina had been given autonomy. And for all intents and purposes, the settlement at Berlin made it so that Russia would come to dominate Bulgaria, and the Austrians were allowed to occupy Bosnia-Herzegovina, with everyone assuming that Austria would one day annex this only nominal Ottoman territory. So this basically left Macedonia and Thrace as the only remaining territories under direct Ottoman control in Europe. But even though the Ottomans would be allowed by the great powers to retain centralized control over what were some fairly strategic regions of the southern Balkans, this control came with serious restrictions. Because the great powers made the Ottomans agree to certain reforms in the region concerning the treatment of Christians. And an assumed part of this arrangement was that the great powers would intervene on behalf of these Christians should the great powers feel that these Christians were being mistreated. Well, seeing as the last great power intervention, actually happening right now at the Congress of Berlin, had led to the near complete dismemberment of the empire, you can probably imagine why the Ottomans might be a teensy bit resentful of these restrictions placed on what was essentially the one European territory left under direct Ottoman control. And then, we have not touched upon this yet, but similar restrictions were also placed on the regions of eastern Anatolia, where there were large populations of Christian Armenians. Now, the Armenians will be a huge, gigantic part of our story moving forwards, but there is just not enough time to dig into everything within this specific episode. But don't worry, we will be covering the long and tragic story that is the Armenian liberation struggle. So, for now, just know that there had been an Armenian delegation at the Congress of Berlin pressing the great powers to grant the Armenians autonomous rule over what were being called the 6 Armenian provinces of eastern Anatolia. However, mainly because these territories had very large populations of Muslims, in addition to the large population of Armenians, autonomy was not granted to the Armenians. But the great powers did make the Ottomans promise that they would reform the region in order to better protect the lives of Armenians living in eastern Anatolia. And as part of this arrangement, Sultan Abdul Hamid and his government would basically have to check in with the great powers and update them on the progress of these reforms and the overall status of the Armenians. And then, if the great powers decided that things weren't going as they should, it was assumed that they reserved the right to intervene on behalf of the Armenians. So, just as with the Christians of Macedonia, the Armenians were also promised protection by the great powers, and this protection was to be ensured through the threat of armed intervention. In reality, the great powers would not follow through on these promised reforms in any meaningful way. And what this would mean is that the actual real-life result of this arrangement was that it made Sultan Abdul Hamid super-duper paranoid about the Christians of his empire, especially the Macedonians, and even more especially the Armenians. The Sultan would become terrified of a repeat of the Russo-Turkish War and the Congress of Berlin, which again had been initiated by national liberation struggles in the Balkans, and these liberation struggles had set off a chain of events that had then led to the empire's dismemberment. Well, guess where national liberation struggles will begin to heat up in the wake of the Congress of Berlin? That's right, amongst the Slavs of Macedonia and amongst the Armenians of eastern Anatolia. So, throughout Abdul Hamid's 30-year rule, the heart of revolutionary activity in the Ottoman Empire will center in Macedonia and in the 6 Armenian provinces. And this is because the fate of both of these provinces had been left so very unresolved at the Congress of Berlin. Were Macedonia and the Armenian provinces going to eventually become autonomous regions like Bulgaria? Or were they going to remain under centralized Ottoman control? Or would the Russians swoop in and help to carve out some more Christian nation-states? Well, the unresolved status of these areas will lead many Armenians and Macedonians to press hard for their autonomy, or even their eventual independence. And these activists and revolutionaries will continue to use the same strategy of sparking violent nationalist uprisings, often with the very specific aim of trying to prompt great power intervention. Because hadn't that strategy just gained independence for Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania and achieved autonomy for Bulgaria? Who's to say that autonomy or independence could not also be achieved through armed struggle in Macedonia or eastern Anatolia as well? And really, this is the same dynamic we've seen time and again going all the way back to the Greek Revolution, when Alexandros Ypsilantis launched his initial attack in the Danubian principalities with the hope that the Ottomans would overreact, and that Ottoman repression of Christians would then lead the Russians to intervene. And then, of course, this process is exactly what happened after the April Uprising, as Bulgarian rebels prompted the Bulgarian horrors. And these massacres led Russia to declare war on the Ottomans. And so, with these promises of reform and intervention made at the Congress of Berlin, the great powers were unwittingly encouraging these sorts of small-scale uprisings to continue indefinitely. And so, seeing as Abdul Hamid will launch murderous campaigns against their communities, uprisings in Macedonia and eastern Anatolia will continue indefinitely through the end of the 19th century and on into the 20th. Okay, so as we enter the 30-year period between the Congress of Berlin in 1878 and the Constitutional Revolution of 1908, this is the backdrop. A slightly traumatized and increasingly paranoid Sultan Abdul Hamid will establish a repressive autocratic regime. And as the opposition to the Sultan's rule continues to grow in size and influence, Abdul Hamid will begin to conflate his own personal safety with the safety of the empire, and he will see enemies all around him, whether they be great power diplomats trying to snatch away more of his domains, or revolutionary conspirators hoping to assassinate him. And this gnawing paranoia will lead Abdul Hamid to continuously grow his ever-present secret police, with the hope of stamping out any activity that has even the slightest whiff of revolution. Because Abdul Hamid will associate such revolutionary activity with great power intervention and with the empire's dismemberment. And at first, the Macedonians and the Armenians will bear the brunt of this repression, falling victim to terrible arbitrary violence as Abdul Hamid initiates horrific massacres against Christians that will honestly make the Bulgarian horrors seem kind of humane, and which will earn him the moniker the Red Sultan. And then as the 19th century becomes the 20th, opposition to the Sultan's regime will ripple out to other parts of the empire. And it will not only be revolutionary Christian nationalists who will challenge the Sultan, but also the graduates of the Sultan's elite military and professional schools. And as Abdul Hamid sends more and more of these rebellious young Turks into exile, the nucleus of a revolutionary vanguard will begin to form in the salons of Paris, London, Geneva, and Cairo. And these exiles will find that what they most had in common was that they all had, in some way or another, been personally wronged by the Sultan. And so, as so often happens, Abdul Hamid's own repressive, paranoid rule will in fact turn out to be the driving force bringing all of the disparate revolutionary movements of the empire together in their shared hatred of the Red Sultan. Because Armenians will resent the Sultan for the horrific atrocities committed against their community, and Bulgarians will resent the Sultan for depriving them of their rightful claim to the big Bulgaria of San Stefano. And journalists and bureaucrats and doctors and lawyers who still wanted a say in government will resent the Sultan for his suppression of the free press and for his implementation of the new secret police that will force them to live in constant fear of arrest or exile simply for having oppositional politics. But perhaps most importantly, young, ambitious junior army officers will blame the Sultan for the many humiliations endured at the hands of the European powers, and they will see the Sultan's strategy of great power appeasement as an affront to their national honor. And once this incredibly diverse coalition of ethnic minorities, young professionals, middling bureaucrats, and junior army officers are all brought together in their shared hostility towards the Sultan, they will suddenly burst forth onto the world stage in 1908 as they force Abdul Hamid to reinstate the constitution and reconvene parliament. But before we can get to 1908, we need to watch the Ottomans lose even more territory, because the shrinking of the empire will not stop with the Treaty of Berlin, and the empire will continue to rapidly shed its peripheral territories. And to add insult to injury, this territory won't be lost to their ancient rivals in Russia, but instead to their historic allies in Great Britain and France, who the Ottomans will increasingly see as just yet another treacherous enemy. So, join me next week as we head back down to Egypt and see how the first sparks of Egyptian nationalism will sadly not lead to Egyptian liberation, but will instead see one master traded for another, as a proto-nationalist revolt will lead the British to accidentally occupy Ottoman Egypt and proceed to never leave.